Hi, everybody. My name is Adrian De Leon. I'm an assistant professor of U.S. history at New York University, and also this is something I just got 2 weeks ago, incoming co-chair of the School of Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU. I'm the author of, I guess, a bunch of books across different genres. Most recently, the poetry collection Barangay and Offshore Poem, published by Book Writer Books in 2021, and Bundok, A Hinterland History of Filipino America, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2023. I am also almost complete, as in its forthcoming, my second academic book called Balikbayan, The Invention of the Filipino Homeland, which will be released by the University of Washington Press sometime, hopefully, 2026. And I mentioned those three together because those are the three different pivot points that I want to frame the conversation around today, because I conceptualize the three of them not as separate projects, but as a sustained triptych of works that asks us to think about the relationship between the nation state and diasporas, between subjecthood and subjugation in the nation state, as the relationship between native diasporas and indigenous people. At what point do people stop becoming native, stop becoming indigenous? And also thinking about the relationship between nationalism, state formation, and capital. All these sort of axiomatic questions about Philippine, not just Philippine history, but also area studies, ethnic studies, and the ways that we might bridge them beyond what Benedict Anderson has called the specter of comparisons, or even beyond more popular formations today, like the sort of capital flows model of Trans-Pacific studies or global Asia studies. So that's my personal and professional trajectory overlap, is that I approach Asian American studies as someone who is not American. I was born in the Philippines and I was raised in Canada. And I was educated in Canada as well, all the way from, the BA to the PhD. And so, not to exceptionalize Canada, and far from it, right? I actually see it as something, as a white settler state in relation to something like the United States. But it got me thinking about what it meant to study American empire as somebody who, is both a scholar and a migrant who has always been haunted by the United States, even if I had never lived there before. Graduate school for a brief time, and then my tenure track job. What it meant for me was really reckoning with the ways that, as a discipline, history, right, and also in terms of our different fields, ethnic studies, um, Philippine studies, etc., we don't often realize it, but we're actually rehearsing the language and the narrative of the nation, and specifically the nation state. Um, and what I mean by that is when we say something like ethnic studies, right, what we actually mean is American ethnic studies. When we say immigration history, what we mean is American immigration history. And I want to think about what it meant to conceptualize migration differently in a way that asks us to complicate the different, first principles we've inherited, both in the academy, but also as just like everyday people living in the diaspora. And it got me asking just, multiple questions that really got me thinking, both first about how to do diasporic history, and also realizing that what I was actually doing is using diaspora to tell a different story of the nation state. And so the first question I asked was, what does it mean to constitute yourself as a Filipino on stolen land? What does it mean to arrive on stolen shores? And that's the question that formed the first poem of the book Barangay and Offshore Poem. And in that, you sort of use like barangay as a sort of like, analytic, right? That both means the basic political unit of Philippine life, but also an outrigger boat. And I asked us to think about what it means to look at displacement, arrival, non-arrival, as my student Anne of Tran would say, and multiple displacements and relational dispossessions in a way that resists the language of something like belonging. Like we leave our home country and suddenly we arrive to America, and here we are, and we are settled, and we're trying to be American, right? What does it mean to actually conceptualize a diasporic language and epistemology outside of that? The second question that I asked was called "Who counts as a Filipino?" Right? It's a question that on the surface appears to be about belonging, but actually underneath is actually a critique of the nation and how the nation forms ideas of ethnic identity and racial formations, right? And so that formed the book Bundok, A Hinterland History of Filipino America, in which I decided to say, let's not naturalize either the United States or the Philippines, right? Let's zoom into the longer plantation histories of northern Luzon, the relational histories between lowlands Ilocano people and highlands Igorot people, and all the other native and indigenous people in that region, and think about what American power, what global capital, and what migration, aka Filipino America, look like from this hinterland space. And what I ended up finding was the persistence of indigenous politics within the diaspora, right? We often think of Asianness and indigeneity. We'll get into this later as something that is separate, right? But actually, that tension is what enables us to problematize the nationalism we've inherited in what we call the home country, right? And then to the third question, that got me really rethinking the nation and the nation state specifically was, I was trying to do all these sustained projects about imagining diaspora outside of the nation state. It took me to the water, then it took me to a diasporic history of the land, and yet the nation state persists, right? What would it mean then to actually write a history of the making of the Philippine nation state through diaspora? And so I used the motif of return migration and its codependence with the idea of a homeland and all of its sort of different, word clouds, right? Like repatriation, right? What is the patria of the of patriation and repatriation, right? What does it mean then, which becomes the question, to go home, right? And how can we use this homecoming as a way to talk about diaspora? And what I actually found was a really kind of unexpectedly dark and insidious story, right? Because I was doing this history about, nostalgia and longing and all the different kinds of ways that Filipino migrants have had, a relationship with their home nation. But then what I ended up finding was this long story of multiple empires, as well as the post-colonial state itself, seizing upon those feelings and turning them into economy, turning them into territoriality, turning them into conquest, right? What is the difference, for example, after Filipino exclusion between repatriation and deportation? And why is it that so many people imagine deporting Filipino migrants from California to Mindanao to be part of the settler colonial project, right, of the Philippines? And I kind of, this was actually kind of the perfect space to give that away. So where I landed with this last question is it got me thinking about what the nation state actually means, right? As a as a sort of like assembled technology of conquest, right? As this sort of a bureaucratic administrative artifice that ideologically uses the nation, the idea of the nation to replicate itself. But one of the arguments I make in this forthcoming book is that the hyphen of the nation state is racism. And what I mean by that, and this is drawing, from a long genealogy of scholars as well, right? But what I mean by that for the Filipino diaspora is that racism as something that is manufactured, to expose differentiated populations to premature death, right, according to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is actually the technique through which countries lay claim to subjects both at home and abroad, who is eliminable, who is, a future citizen, a future subject, a non-citizen, a non-subject. And return migration. So all these innocent feelings we have of going home was actually at the heart and center of this, real colonial, imperial, and I would argue, and I have argued in this book, fascist formation of the Philippine nation state. Especially as I was coming to, the most recent project that I just finished, I realized how indebted I was to radical geographers, like radical human geographers. I imagined different kinds of conversations between, um, you know, um, um, David Harvey and Ruthie Gilmore, and the ways that they think about surplus, right? And you know, the ways that they think about unused or unusable or unproductive space. Obviously, in like the context of the 60s, 70s, 80s, right, with the rise of the prison industrial complex, with what Harvey calls the spatial fix, all these different kinds of concepts, right? But I retconned it to some of my earlier works, and Barangay, the poetry collection, is a spatial theory of diaspora. It's an anarchist spatial theory of diaspora. And anarchism, right, as an analytic, but much less so like as a European intellectual tradition, but as you know a critique that actually asks us to think against and beyond the archaic, right, the authority, the sovereignty of the nation state. Um, Clarified for me as my fundamental politics, um, when I had my sort of personal like geographical turn and geographical reckoning. And so, in Bundok, right, like even all the way in the 18th century, like the ways that these Spanish economists and administrators, the Bourbonist administrators, right, were going out into Luzon and trying to figure out different ways to workshop how to make this place productive, right? They kept saying the phrase fomentar la industria, right? To foment the industry. And they used a lot of, if not the same, but rhyming language, a language that rhymes with that, the growth of the prison industrial complex, of like that age of stagflation, around the Rust Belt, around revitalization, right? There's a sense that nature and space is dead unless it is subject to what Marx has called that metabolic rift of capital, right? And extraction. Um, and that made it click. I think the sort of like spatial politics of how I conceptualize, displacement and like economics and stuff like that. The other debt I had was to a geographer named Doreen Massey, who's really one of the foundational thinkers for what we would call cultural geography, but specifically like feminist geography. And she, in her essay and book for space, had a definition of space. Get this, and I will never forget this for the rest of my life, because it just like it blew my mind. I read this during like early lockdown. Space is a simultaneity of stories so far, and I just thought that was beautiful. Um, because it holds into account within its embrace, right, analytical embrace, um, the contingency of the different ways that a people approach being in proximity or conceptualize being in proximity, even if they're at a distance, like nationalism, right? Um, and thus, right, one of the things, and I wrote about this in a photography essay in 2021. If we understand space as the simultaneity of all these different stories so far, all these different lives and contingencies, right? Nationalism, especially official state nationalism, is about eradicating that difference, right, and making it a what Deleuze and Guattari would call like a single refrain, right? You take away all that difference, right, all that contingency and multiplicity and how people conceptualize space together, and it becomes one thing, which is the one narrative, the one nation, which then gets deployed into the state. And this actually segues for me into how I think about internal colonialism, um, because as I was starting my book on return migration, and really the sort of it's a proto history of the Balikbayan program, right? I was much less interested in the program and more about the concept of return migration. Um, it's all these different people from all across the islands, most especially, northern and central Philippines, right? The plantation economies of places like Cebu, northern Luzon, central Luzon, moving to the United States. And then in the 30s, they all, not all, right? But the more, the more establishment kind of folks, right? From like labor leaders to intellectuals, The people who start to have this diasporic political power in California, Washington State, etc. Illinois, I wrote a lot about Chicago as well. Start to articulate a homogeneous idea of provisional nationalism and provisional independence, right? They start to articulate what it means to be a subject of a nation yet to come. And in a lot of ways, in fact, in all the ways, that is an extremely violent imaginary. It means eradicating, Islam, right? It means colonizing the frontiers of the North and the South, right, in the Cordilleras, but also especially in Mindanao. It means, colonizing it on behalf of the Philippines to push out the specter of the Japanese settler, right? It also means colonizing the subject, the self, to eradicate difference with, Ilocano language, Pangasinenses, right, Cebuanos, and learn Tagalog in diaspora to prepare themselves to be the subjects of a Manila-centric Philippine form well before the Philippines gained formal independence, which got me think about internal colonialism, right? What is the actual spatial imaginary that mobilizes return migration to this homogeneous thing called the Philippine homeland? It's settler colonialism, right? And so this is where I'm sort of using it in a way that's inspired by folks working on Mindanao. Most recently, Jorge Matsuda Bayona, right, our mutual friend and colleague, who called it Inherited Destiny. Ollie Charbonneau at Glasgow, who worked on, stuff on the Philippine South and, corrective violence, and a lot of older works as well, right, by Patricio Benales, etc. And I wanted to think about how the diaspora was actually folded into that project of colonizing Mindanao, right? That stems from like that Spanish colonialism and all the way on. And so, what does it mean to actually think about internal colonialism when the internal is not yet determined, right? In a lot of ways, Mindanao, in both the homeland and the diasporic imagination, is imagined as being within the Philippine state prior to the actual introduction of a robust settler state, right? And that robust settler state and those settler societies only really take off post 1946, post independence, right? But as a continuation, as a sort of fulfillment of these longer projects of colonization that had been imagined since like the 1900s, the 1910s, right, under American occupation, that then get inherited and then propagated by the post-colonial Philippines itself, right? And so this is a conversation that I know is really salient to your work. It got me thinking about what happens after your book, Ellen, right? Like what happens after conditional decolonization without economic independence, and thus what happens to all these recalcitrant subjects that are resisting the Philippine nation state. Well, they're trying to send the Hukbalahap to Mindanao. They're trying to people Mindanao, right? Like they're trying to scoop up all the surplus land, right? And like that to me is internal colonialism, which is actually settler colonialism. Even and especially when there are no white people settling, right, in that post-war period. Read the opening of the book because it's the second academic book, so I had this like sort of freedom to compose it without like the vicissitudes of like being, a legitimate historian. I'm like, whatever, right? I'm in a history department, screw it. But I asked just like the sequence of questions that I'm going to ask, the listeners to hang on to. And it goes like this. So for context, the book is structured in two acts. So I think about the structure. So every book I write, I think about the structure first before I actually write the book itself. Like it's a mnemonic, right? For folks who are, thinking about writing theses, dissertations, etc. It helps to scale out even when you're in the nitty gritty. So the book is in two parts, in two acts, right? And I think about it as acts because in a lot of ways, it's the rehearsal of provisional citizenship, right? So there's a sort of theatrical performative element to it. The first act is called patriation. the original use of which is actually Canadian, right? The patriation of the Canadian Constitution, right? Which have been held in the UK under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Um, and that is about the creation of a synchrony of what the Philippines is among diasporic and like homeland, trans-Pacific and global subjects, right? And then the second act is called repatriation. It's after that synchrony happens, and really after the 1934 Timings-McDuffie Act, which grants provisional independence while also excluding Filipinos to a quota of 50 per year migrating to the United States. That's when repatriation really becomes a salient, both as an idea and as an economy, right, in the Philippines and in the diaspora. The first line and the last line of the book are the exact same because the book is then structured as a return migration. So the opening of the book is called Bayan. It goes like this. What does it mean to go home? At what point, for instance, did the entire territorial claims of a nation state come to signify the emigrant's home country, even if the diasporic subject has no ancestral claims to another town, region, ethno-linguistic group, or island within those national borders? And in the case of the Philippines and Filipino migration, what did it mean to be from and go back to a country under colonial occupation in which the nation and the nation state which it comes to signify were still very much in formation? And what did the making of a modern country, the Philippines, within the rise of a regional language to hegemonic status, Tagalog, and a regional city becoming the center of statecraft, Manila, mean for both non-Tagalog diasporas and indigenous peoples who had nothing in common with the cultural contours of the nascent metropole and nation state, who now came to identify or were coerced into identifying with it? That's the opening paragraph of the book. And I want to start with that because that actually gets us that like, you know, going back to the internal colonialism question, um, it got me thinking about someone like Monica Kim, the historian Monica Kim, who does stuff on US-Korea relations and the Korean War. And she argued that in the 1950s, you know, the Korean War was not just about territory, but about the colonization of the subject, right, through interrogation, torture, etc. She draws a lot from my beloved advisor, actually, right, Pak Fujitani, who wrote In Race for Empire, right, that the US-Japan War was actually about claiming ethnic minorities, subjugated ethnic minorities for this sort of imperial racial project. And I said, actually, that goes way back, you know? In the US occupation of the Philippines, you know, what gets me thinking is the fact that from the onset, the nation state, the Philippine nation state, is designed to be diasporic, right? It's, you know, area studies approaches a nation and national context within the territoriality, right? Even region, right? And everything kind of fills in after, right? Like you do Southeast Asian studies, you study the region, right? You do Japan studies, you study Japan, right? In ethnic studies, we study the subject, right? There's in the sloppiest, most liberal iterations of ethnic studies, like the imagined territorialities of the United States itself, right? But by and large, right, we are interested in the subject, right? And so what is it actually? And so one of the things that it got me thinking about was actually Philippine studies needs ethnic studies methods, even if it's not in the United States. You know, what does it mean to constitute the Philippine nation state through a study of its subjects who, from the onset, have always been on the move, and from the onset, right? And this goes back to Barangay and Bundok as well, right? Um, whose movement and immobility and the control and economization thereof has always been at the heart and center of colonial statecraft, right? It's a short, you know, within the decade after, you know, the Spanish American War, 1898, you know, American recruiters from the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association going to the Philippines and recruiting Ilocanos right to Hawaii, and then it eventually balloons after, you know, the after Herbert Hoover really takes on like the agricultural project in the United States, and he starts, you know, then Filipino migrants become like the dominant labor force, right, of the American West. Um, what does it mean then to constitute, right, a Philippine nation, an independent nation state, reckoning with the fact that there are these hundreds of thousands of people outside of the territorial boundaries who they imagine will be repatriated one day in that sort of future conditional sense. That is a different way to approach territoriality. That is a different way to approach state formation. Not just from the demographic questions of like, emigration and immigration, but from the onset, those migrants abroad were one of, if not the priority, right, of that colonial nation state. And if we take somebody like Filomeno Aguilar, the historian, seriously, right, that all studies of Philippine politics cannot ignore the country's most important resource, which is its surplus labor, its diasporic labor, then we got to walk that all the way back, right, to the colonial period too. Um, which is why the Philippines is so interesting for me as something that, perpetually, I think, shifts so many conversations in both area and ethnic studies, especially Asian American studies, because of what seems to be its exceptional quality, but it's not, right? It's actually one of those clear case studies, that and Guahan and Hawaii for sure, right? Okinawa later, right? Those clear colonial case studies of how American empire, right, and elite capture of nationalism depend on these subjects inside and outside of the territories that it claims. I'll be as precise as possible with it because I think and this is not a critique of Native American studies. This is actually a critique of how scholars universalize it, right? Like what makes Native American studies like at its best, right, is when it is hyperlocal, right? And it worlds from there. One of the things that became, I think, unavoidable as I was writing this chapter was, the ways I was drawing on ethnohistorians like Una Paredes, works from, the Andes as well that I was thinking about, Paul Barkley on Taiwan, um, Katsuya Hirano on the Ainu, right? And sort of Japanese settler colonialism as part of the formation of like, national economy in that like early Meiji period. Um, that in the Philippines, we need less in the Philippines, in the Filipino diaspora, we need a really sharp definition of indigeneity and its relationship to nativeness. Because, the sort of like um in what Glenn Coulthard might call, those like liberal, settler liberal politics of recognition, um, there's an easy move um, for Filipino diaspora people to say, I'm from the Philippines, I'm indigenous to the Philippines. It's not the same, right? The argument I make in Bundok is that um, all indigenous people from in the Philippines specifically, right? And there's merit to being specific. All indigenous people are native, but not all native people are indigenous. Um, this accounts for the fact that there is a friction and not a similitude between indigeneity and racialization, right? And that's something I bring up in Bundok as well, right? Indigeneity is always subjected to racialization through stereotype, through, et cetera, right? But it's not race, right? It's mediated through race, but it's not explicitly race, right? A useful analog, I think, would be two things, right? The difference between Palestinian indigeneity and Pan-Arabism, the difference between the articulations of indigeneity from between Zionism and Palestinians, right? Articulations of indigeneity, um, also elsewhere in Southeast and East Asia, right? Indigeneity in the Philippines has a very specific political relationship with the state, right? That I looked at in Bundok, right, stemming from, the Salvajes, the non-Christian tribes, and that sort of like political, spatial, and subjective political management of, what kinds of people become disposable labor, right? To be Marxian about it, which is the lowlands native, and what kinds of people become dispensable lives, right? And are in the way of capital expansion, which is the highlands indigenous. Um, that is important to be specific about in diaspora because the way that indigeneity, and I wrote about this in this piece on atavism, right? The way that indigeneity is refracted on an individual level in the diaspora is often as a project of reclamation. And when it becomes a project of reclamation from non-indigenous diasporas, right, that leads to the sort of romanticization of the pre-colonial, right? We just need to return to our pre-colonial roots. We need to know the old ways of tattooing. We need to know the old ways of weaving, etc. And it's like, no, that actually assumes indigenous people are always already dead. And that is anything but true, you know? Um, and you know, all I think all I wanted to bring up those three concepts in our conversation today and really expand on them because they all overlap. Like they're all the kinds of axiomatic questions that we take for granted in the diaspora, you know, and a diaspora which has such little access to you know mainstream public education about Philippine history, let alone Filipino diasporic history, right? So in that absence, right, like the diaspora creates ideas of historicity, right, the sense of self in the past, um, that are necessary and important and anachronistic, right, but also are dangerous and can become resources for a much more fascistic project, right? Like the Marcoses and their relationship with diaspora people like Vanessa Hudgens, right? Who now works as the ambassador of global tourism for the Philippines. Those are just some of these examples that I want to use to highlight that. Where I used it in Bundok was in the conclusion called A Tale of Two Mountains. And I wanted to do a comparative spatial history between Mount Rushmore and Marcos's ripoff of Mount Rushmore, which is the Marcos bust, right? On Iboloy land. And um, you know, there was really something to be said there about the way that Marcos, as a lowlands native, but also as a cacique, as an elite dynastic figure, and also as an authoritarian, in the days and weeks leading up to his declaration of martial law, went took an atavistic turn. He went up to Baguio, went to a retreat, and was like, I'm going to reconnect with my roots, center myself to God in the land that he claims is his. And God is going to tell me to declare martial law. Like this was in his diaries, right? That Ambeth Ocampo presented on in 2017 in the University of Hawaii. Um, and it is also not a coincidence that at the same time that Imelda was building her like you know national cultural projects, right? Imelda and Ferdinand were building their mythos around being you know like sort of proximate demigods, right? The Malakas Maganda. Um, it's in under martial law that indigenous peoples in the Philippines are you know are subjected to like probably like the most magnified and systematic forms of settler violence against them, right? The banning of headhunting, the near complete penetration of the Cordilleras by all these infrastructural projects, military occupations, right? This is also when, you know, both indigenous and Moro, but also communist uprisings in Mindanao are at their strongest, right? Because of just like that direct interface with like this violent expansion, right? But this is all going on. That material of military history is all going on at the same time that the Marcoses are claiming themselves as the inheritors of the nation and deploying all these sort of, you know, Pedro Paterno-esque, right? Myth making projects around their relationship with like national mythology. Um, and then also, you know, like the Marcoses sponsorship of you know these of pageants, right? And dances and dance troupes, right? Bayanihan, etc. Right? And I keep thinking about the fact that you know these cultural projects are happening coevally with these settler projects of conquest, right? And what does that mean for the material history of the Philippines, right? The material conquest of these frontiers to be coupled with a nationalization of mythology, right? I see that with the way that Apofang Ud, right, is being taken on by the Philippines as a sort of cultural hero and cultural relic, right? Um, Notwithstanding the fact that you know the tattooing tradition is alive and well in Kalinga, right? She becomes this resource, right? Her image becomes this resource for the Philippines to peg itself down to a pre-colonial past, and thus the Philippine state to articulate its legitimacy. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to start with probably my favorite history book of all time, which is Stephanie Camp's Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance of the Plantation South. Before she, as you know, right before she passed away, she was a history professor at the University of Washington. Um, and one of the reasons why that book continuously blows me away while also being an anchor is it is a book about plantation geographies while being a history of Black women, enslaved Black women, right? Um, in the antebellum South. And in the introduction to chapter one is something that I just kept coming back to, which is the way that she defines the plantation as this immobilizing project. And really kind of grounded it in terms of the management of space, the meticulous management of space, and not just like even like imaginative space too, right? Through the management of reproduction, the management of time, right? It's when the work day, right? The plantation work day, right? But also then she launches into this entire investigation of all the different creative ways that Black women not just resisted, but just like worlded something otherwise. You know, Running off into the forest to meet secret lovers, right? The Sunday markets, the gardens, right? And I kept thinking, right, this is a fugitive ecology. That if we stop and end at the plantation, likewise, if we stop and end with its afterlife, the nation state, um, we don't get how people actually lived and always kept undoing, right? This is why these projects are so violent, right? It's because all these fugitive subjects are constantly, just by virtue of living, right, are undoing that disciplinary logic of the plantation. And I thought, yeah, that is the way to study the Ilocano subject. One of the things that it got me thinking about that is not a chapter I ended up writing was I wanted to write about Ilocano gardening, both at home and in the diaspora. And I wrote about it for this forthcoming anthology called Halo Halo Ecologies by Marvin Montefrio and Alyssa Paredes. Um, and thinking about the way that Ilocano cuisine actually comes out of scarcity and all those different places that are like marginally arable outside of, monoculture, things like bitter melon, right? And all those like scrappy foods. Stephanie Camp worlded that entire thing. Like her work, right? Like really just made the Filipino migrant subject just imaginable for me in ways that I don't think any Asian American studies book has ever done for me, let alone any immigration history book, truly. The second book I want to talk about is Dion Brand's I'm After the Door of No Return. It's her work has all it's one of those things that like we read as, students growing up in Toronto. And it's one of the lodestones, right, that I keep coming back to because, she imagines the world from Trinidad, where she's from, and then she imagines the world through Toronto, where she lives. Um, and she imagines the transatlantic, she imagines the Caribbean, she imagines global capitalism. And she also likewise imagines like um, what it means in her case, what it means for, the transatlantic Black diaspora, to imagine going home when that severing has already happened, right? When there is no return migration except in the imagination. Even when you materially go there, like people read Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman as a return migration, story. And that is a project too that is resonant and indebted to Dion Brand's Map to the No Return. And I think about the fact that for, Black diaspora, um, that door is a no space, right? And for the Filipino diaspora, the door has been pre-designed for us, and it's called the homeland. It's called the bayan, right? And it's been pre-designed for us because every time we pass through, we fortify the nation state. And so balikbayan, but literally like everything I think about the diaspora is a response to map. And I'm really glad it's sort of really been taken up by scholars right now because it's really just fantastic. From Philippine studies, actually, like the scholar, any work by the scholar Doreen Fernandez, people know her as a food writer, right? She's sort of known as the dean of Philippine food history, right? She wrote Set Up, Essays on Philippine Food, which has long been out of print, became on Essays Philippine Food and Culture, which was republished by Brill. Um, and all these other works that she and her co-author published. Um, it's not about it wasn't it was both about and not about the food for me. It was about the way that she understood the native subject as performing with the ecology around them, right? So like you see the ways that it's like resonant with someone like Stephanie Camp, right? Like she thinks about the creativity of the street vendor under martial law without naming martial law because she was working under martial law, right? She thinks about the native women who interact with the flora and the fauna to create nourishment, and what better way to understand diaspora than as an ecology on the move through food writing? Then I want to bring up maybe a couple others. So I was torn which one to like bring up because like I'm both very much like a Walter Benjamin guy and also a Jacques Derrida guy. Most people are either Foucauldian or Marxist, I think, in our line of work. Um, I'm neither in both. Like I'm really interested in the ways that like okay, those like structures of power and those structures of capital that those two talk about, how do they register at the vernacular level, right? For me, that's people who think about displacement, that's people who think about phenomenology, that's people who think about time. Um, that's people who think about dispossession, that's people who think about the stuff that gets left behind when you leave home. And to me, that's both Benjamin and Derrida, right? And the last one is a sleeper hit, which we talked about right before this. It's a guy named Jean-Luc Nancy who wrote an essay called The Inoperative Community. Um, and I bring that up because it's formative, especially in queer of color critique. Jose Esteban Munoz's Defense of Brown, right? For example, but also I think it should be read as political theory, and I think it should be read as a framework for political history. Um, because the first thing he takes down is human rights. What is the human who's fighting for the rights for the human? What do we do to get out of that tautology, right? What is the individual subject if not a relationship to somebody else, right? He theorizes that whole thing around being with, right? Like I constitute myself because I constitute myself in relation to you. He thinks about the subject and not the individual. He's the consummate theorist. Um, him and someone like Edouard Glissant, right? Are really like the consummate theorists of relation. And thus, in ethnic studies, are the consummate theorists of community, right? When we articulate something like the Filipino community, the Asian American subject, we're articulating a mythos and a fantasy that we think is concrete and actually real, right? And it would actually benefit us to go back to some of these foundational thinkers of what a community is, um, and just complicate that a little bit, right? Know when we're strategically using the term Asian American, to enact a sort of strategic essentialism, but also know where it stops, right? Lest we just, follow the dinosaur that is the Asian American subject, right? Um, Otherwise, it just becomes this tautological project. So yeah, those are the ones I wanted to bring up. Those are the ones that like definitely my students know I keep bringing up in my classes, and they're also the ones that like give my students a lot of hell, especially Nancy and Derrida. But it's worth it. It's really worth it. Um, yeah, so admittedly, I don't read a lot of Asian American scholarship. I read a lot of Asian American literature, and Asian diasporic literature. I think like the scholarship just kind of rehearses the same point. And that's a hot take that I'm going to throw in there as the Easter egg. We got to do better Asian Americanists. Um, but from literature though, oh my God, there's so much. I've been um I think maybe since 2013, 14, I keep coming back to this book called Light by Suvankam Thamavamsa, who's a Lao refugee in Canada. People know her best for her stories in The New Yorker, her short story collection, How to Pronounce Knife. which came out and won like a million prizes. But before that, she was a poet. So her book Light is probably the most stunning collection of poetry I've ever read. Um, it made barangay happen. Like um, there's such an economy, right, to it. A sort of meditative economy that asks you to think about, displacement in relation to the actual letter on the page, right? It's just like this like complete like I would even say like anti-capitalist meditative slow experience of reading and writing, right? That you got to keep coming back, right? You can't just eat it and go away. The second one is again like I'm going to bring up Now to the Door of No Return by Dion Brand, right? Like that's it's a theory book that is mistaken as a memoir, right? Written by a poet. Um, and then I actually want to bring up this book called Zong exclamation mark. It's a poetry collection by Norbise Philip, who also came out of the Toronto scene, right? But um that is the book that first ever got me thinking about archives in a critical way. She takes the case of like this one, I think it was like a murder trial of the murder of an enslaved person on the boat Zong. And she takes the entire court case and just completely vivisects it um, and rearranges it as poetry to actually capture the emotional truth of enslavement. Um, and it's an archival document as much as this literary metaphor, right? And I think just like that book in particular has really shaped and formed the way I approach archives, which is not in that hagiographic sense of like, let's just tell the story that we get from the archive, but as a thing we actually have to dismantle sometimes, right? And then the last one I want to bring up is my favorite anime of all time. It's called Neon Genesis Evangelion. Um, and I use that to teach Jean-Luc Nancy's The Inoperative Community. And my graduate students will know this. At the very end of Evangelion, right, which is the first movie that happens after the series, right? The character Shinji has to make a choice. All the human, he triggers this cataclysmic event through his like complete like Hannah Arendtian form of like negative like individual subject formation where he's completely nihilistic and self-absorbed. And he triggers this like cataclysmic event where everybody gets reduced into like the primordial soup and like shares a single consciousness. It's that sort of like fascist death drive, right? That Nazist fascist death drive of a single ethnos, a single consciousness, right? Which is why Arendt calls Nazism, you know, um, like a suicidal project, right? It's an autophagus project, right? It eats itself. Um, but at the end, Shinji chooses to constitute himself in relation. And he brings in like his former teammate, who he has like a really disturbing relationship with, Asuka, and he brings her back and himself back, and they like hate each other, but like they're both choosing to be in relation and just to exist, even if it means they have to go through suffering, and even if it means they're like individual like flesh suits. Um, and that's how I teach the inoperative community. You see where this is going, right? It's like how better to teach the choice you have to make between similitude as community, which is like itself like a fascistic imaginary, and community as this assemblage of like people relating in difference, being with indifference without similitude, right? Um, even even anime, yeah. I love that anime. And I keep going back to it to teach critical theory. Like, like I think I've named probably in equal measure like sprinkling of Philippine people, but a lot of Caribbean studies people, and like a lot of like German Jewish philosophers. Um, that's just kind of where I'm at, right? Like, um, and on that note, like the first book I'm really excited about is Ryan Jobson's book. So he's this anthropologist at the University of Chicago. He's come out with this book called The Petrostate Masquerade, and it's thinking about Trinidad and Tobago as a petrostate, um, and thinking about all the ways that like it performs sort of economic determinism, right? And sort of like speculative futures, like hyper optimistic speculative futures, as what he calls a masquerade, and he uses the masquerade as a pivot point, to think about like Moss, right? Playing Moss, right? Which is like the sort of like vernacular masquerade that happens at Carnival, especially right in Trinidad, um, and just that like state society interface that Philippine studies is really good at as well as Caribbean studies is really good at. I'm really excited for because I've been reading a lot of stuff on like petrocapital and like the contemporary subject to think about um, some of my new work on petrocapital and like the post Marcos period and the late Marcos period. I'm just excited for his work. I think he's just like a brilliant historical anthropologist in that like classic way, right? That like rigorous like field work meets like archival research way, right? In that Deirdre Dela Cruz, Ben Anderson, but also, Trujillo kind of way. Um, the second one I want to I'll shout out three, is my good friend and our colleague Christina Well Peralta's Insurgent Care. She takes on the juggernaut of Filipino American history, which is the history of nursing and care work, and she completely undoes it. It is such an exciting project. You would expect her to start in somewhere like 1898. Nope, she goes right to that end to that postbellum South. She looks at the relationship of like Jim Crow era medical like experimentation and like the colonization of the Philippines, but also thinking about like Filipino women's knowledge, right? Ecological knowledge as something that creates ideas of healthcare. So it's not just a sort of like like it's the other sides of the story that Catherine Sinisa Choi told us, right? About the imposition of American healthcare onto Filipino subjects, and that's what creates the current labor economy that we have today. But she's like, no, let's actually start from Native women and think about their relationship with health, and thus their relationship with ecology, their relationship with like indigenous medical knowledge. And she just like does it from the ground up. It's a really exciting project. Um, I'm hoping to take it from like what will be a sleeper hit to like a hit. I'm just like putting everybody on her work. She's a very careful writer, so like the stuff is a little bit slower to come out, but like it's just like every single thing she puts out like will make a wave, will like make waves. It's really cool stuff. And then the last one is my graduate student who is going to be on the market this year, and her dissertation and future book, um, which, as you can tell, like I love shit that like upends like inherited knowledge, and she's taken on critical refugee studies, and she's taken on the humanisms of Asian American history, and she's thinking about what if we do this history of surplus, of the discarded, right? And so her book project will be called "The Ark Is Already Gone," and it's about think about like a rewriting of um, the Vietnamese refugee subject in a way that refuses landing, citizenship, humanism, right? Like she's gonna begin with like she she has chapters on stuff like the how at what point does somebody become diasporic even before they left? At what point do they make that choice? What happens when arrival is impossible? What happens if it's uninhabited? What happens if you're turned away? What happens if you're washed up? All these kinds of things that refuse like the helicopter logic, right? Of that photograph, that famous Follow Saigon photograph, right? Of uplift, of racial uplift. What happens when you're discarded? And I saw the project click together when we were reading Decolonization, Race, and Remaindered Life Under Empire by Nefertiti Tadior, 2015. And it just like made everything click. And so I'm really excited to see the way that like she's really tackling Vietnamese American history through the perspective of both her training in Black studies, but also in Filipino studies. It's really exciting stuff. So for the record, I'm putting everybody on that book. It's dope shit. And I can't wait for y'all to read it.